Okay, welcome back, everybody, to the Golden Thread podcast. As you hopefully know by now, we try to blend together myth, story making, mindfulness, meaning, so many things that are so important in today's world. But really, it's just the conversations that make the most import in today's world. So today, we're actually going to be talking about story and the labyrinth. Who knows how much of a labyrinth talk we'll actually get to, but story is so central to our lives. And to do that, we're going to talk about what is obviously the central metaphor for our podcast and even our soon to be nonprofit, which is the golden thread itself. It would be belaboring the point to say how a golden thread relates to story. There are so many analogies, so many sort of hidden words that just indicate that connection, the thread of life, following the thread of a conversation. But we compare the golden thread to your mission statement, your core values, but also your thesis, and you can have a thesis in more than just a written paper or study. So yeah, from Ariadne's golden thread to Rapunzel and her golden hair. I hope we end up talking about maybe introducing the idea of Penelope weaving and unweaving in this context from the Odyssey. But all these things trace back to this idea of the importance of a guiding thread. Very often in folklore, in myth, in story, we have a connection with the archetypal feminine as well. So at some point, I hope that comes into this as well. Where does that connection come from? Why is it so consistent with cloth and thread, etc.? But today we're joined by Dr. Nicole Miller. So she's the founder of the unstorying method. So we're going to hear a little bit more about that, how it relates to story, identity, transformation, and maybe we'll relate that to the labyrinth. But for now, let's pass it off to Nicole.
Thanks, Dylan. Yeah,
Welcome,
I
Nicole.
think, hi everyone. I think that it definitely is connected to the labyrinth, and I will happily, illustrate those areas where it's connected. Unstorying is really the premise that we are made of stories. We situate ourselves in the world based on our stories. We navigate ourselves through the world. Our mind is a kind of a supercomputer of storytelling. And, when you ask most people, are you a good storyteller? A lot of people would say, no, I'm terrible at it. I freeze up. I don't know what to say, without realizing that a million times a day, they're telling stories. They're telling stories internally. They're telling stories to their partner, their child, their boss, their colleague. When we talk, I often say that we don't speak in bullet points. We don't list off the facts of what just happened. We weave a story. And so by doing that, we're automatically thinking about who is the audience and what is the impact that we're hoping to have on them. Do we want to come across as the hero? Do we want to come across as the wise one, the villain, the trickster? Are we the victim of a situation? Do we, what kind of emotional response do we want to engender? We're not even conscious of that half the time when we're having conversations with people, but that's what we're doing. And we're also doing that internally as we, psych ourselves up to do something, or we tell ourselves we can't do something, or overcomplicate things in our lives. And so this storytelling ability or navigation system basically that we have, we don't even realize that we can, go in and alter. And so but only if we can see that we're creating those stories, that we're crafting them and where they're coming from. And so unstorying is not a process to get rid of storytelling. It's not like, when people meditate and often they struggle and they say, I can't meditate. I'm a bad meditator, and you ask them, well, why? Well, because, these thoughts just keep coming and I can't not think about the thoughts. And I said, well, that's what your mind is supposed to do. Your mind is it's doing its job. It's generating thoughts. It's your relationship to those thoughts when they arise that really is the crux of meditation, right? And so the same thing with the stories. Where do these stories come from? Why are we carrying these stories? So after my doctorate at Pacifica, which was really about the stories that people carry in all cultures and belief systems and time periods, and looking at it from a depth psychology point of view, philosophy, literature, and understanding that we're just storytelling beings. What happens when you are in between the stories, in that space in between the stories? And so while I was supposed to be off writing my dissertation, I ended up finding myself in a non-dual group that was really about being in the silence to understand deeply who we are. And as a kid who grew up in New York, New York City,
The
uh,
silence.
yeah, silence was not a natural pull for me. And I
It's
remember,
not in the suburbs either.
no, no, no. I mean, and so I really found myself shocked by what arose when I wasn't engaged in storytelling, and the inner stories that came up really were kind of slapping me in the face. And I came to realize that those were my shadow stories, the fears, the beliefs I had about myself, about how other people should be behaving and acting, and what I needed or thought I needed, and just a myriad of stories. And I realized that that's not me either. Those are also constructed.
Mm,
And once that realization really came in, there was this space that arose that was without a story. And I was still the stories, but I was not just my stories. And I wanted to create something that a bridge for other people to really be able to step back in a simple, straightforward way, that they didn't have to go and sit in Mount Shasta for 2 years in silence, that they could do that in their everyday life. What is the process? What do I do when triggering stories arise and I find myself in drama and wanting to react? What do I do in that moment? How do I know what's actually happening beneath the stories? How do I pull back the projections? Where is the thread for me to go within to see within the labyrinth within myself, which is really what the labyrinth is all about. And then also a guided visualization, which is just another way in to see the symbols and the images that are there embedded in the psyche, just waiting for us to kind of sit with them and meet with them, just as another way to understand what are you carrying that is making up the tapestry of who you are. So that is a very long-winded way of me explaining what this process is. And I work with people one-on-one, but the most exciting thing is that people have started coming to me and saying, I want to do this with other people, because the more
yeah,
people who are willing to do and able to do this work within themselves, they're no longer bringing their stories at other people. They're not projecting it outward. They're seeing it, and there's more responsiveness rather than reactivity happening.
yeah.
That's my goal with that.
That's so awesome. I There's so much of what you said there that resonates with some things that I've recently been doing some work with my counselor, where trying to figure out how to get past some of the barriers in communication with my wife, to be blunt about it. And one of the biggest keys has been framing everything in the story I'm telling myself, because we have to tell stories to fill in blanks of our understanding.
Mhm.
To make sense of anything, we just make up a story. Well, that happened because that. Most of the time, it's completely inconsequential. It doesn't matter because it doesn't influence the behavior, but it bridges the gap so we can move forward. But when there's persistent storytelling and we keep telling ourselves this story, and it becomes the false reality within a relationship, it can do so much harm. So I feel like what you're getting at is starting by knowing that that's a story that we tell ourselves is the starting point of being able to rewrite it. An image that came to mind when you were speaking, perhaps this is a mirror into my own psyche, is I thought of walking into a funny house, mirror house or whatever, where you have lots of distorted images.
Mhm.
And Maybe that's because a lot of the stories I have are distorted images of reality. And the labyrinth for me is like, okay, how can I bend that one back out and make that one less concave? And I'm excited to have this conversation. So thanks
Yeah.
for sharing.
Oh, and 100% what you're saying, 100%. And in fact, my doctorate, my dissertation was on something that I call the world as mythic mirror. I called it the mirrors of Narcissus because I used the Narcissus story really to illustrate it. But it was
Mm,
really about what are the symbols of the mirror that show up in myth, folktale, film, literature that have some sort of opportunity for the character that peers into it. And is it a clear mirror? Often it's not. Often it's,
mm,
a mirror of like the demon mirror in the Snow Queen, which is shattered shards of pain and all of that, or the truth-telling mirror, in Snow White, which would tell the queen whether she wanted to hear it or not, and so what I did was I actually proposed what if Narcissus, when he died after being only in love with himself, peering at his image in the pond, what if he was given the opportunity to look in these different types of mirrors in order to really
mm,
understand himself more deeply? Could he see how he is treating other people and get a sense
mm,
of who the authentic he is? And so by the same token, that is what we do. When we talk about projections out into the world is a mirror of ourselves. And there's a lot of spiritual tenets that are all about this idea of we're not looking at others. We're looking at ourselves, a reflection of ourselves. We are projecting onto that person what our expectation is of who they should be, who we think they are, which is often not exactly who they are. And in
mhm,
relationship, that is, you know, that's rife with that because that's all about what you're bringing up to each other in order to transform. It's an opportunity to transform and to know yourselves better. But most people don't go into relationships with that goal. They go into relationships because they fall in love, they're attracted to the person, they want to start a family, whatever their reasoning is. But the real goal of relationships, any relationships, friends, anything, parent, child, is an opportunity to really know yourself through
Mm.
the relationship with
mm.
that person and the stories that it brings up.
Yeah.
And so mirrors and projections play a huge part in it, for sure.
Yeah.
Mm.
I do think that this connection between story and the labyrinth and now unstoring, just to state the obvious, you do have Ariadne. She doesn't actually have, let's call it the Daedalus view. She doesn't have a any more knowledge of the story, the labyrinth that's going to take place per se. She has an intuitive knowledge of it, right? And so she hands Theseus a way of thinking, right, and a way of taking our birthright, which is this story making human ability, and instead of having it enslave you by through these turns, have it be a guiding thing that takes you, leads you out of that as well. So I think that that's an incredible, you know image for that. And again, it's not just one direction. The story is important. So when you go all the way back to, let's say, the start of this with Freud and saying, he didn't say I am like Oedipus or I'm similar to it. He said I am Oedipus. And that acknowledgement was important, but it's not valuable to say, and therefore I can't do anything that Oedipus different from how Oedipus did, right? You don't want to be enslaved by the story. You just want to be able to see it, and have a little bit of, almost like in Dream, when you are able to start to control your own dream once you acknowledge that it is a dream in the first place.
Yeah, lucid dreaming. Yeah, for sure. And a few things that I would bring up. One is that it I believe it was Ovid, although I don't remember for sure, who did say that Daedalus gave Ariadne the like the directions, like which way
Right.
to go. And it was one of the reasons why he was, imprisoned in the tower after he created the labyrinth, and why he and his son had to
Eight.
had to create wings to try and get out the window. So the architect. It's also an interesting metaphor. The architect of the place of going within, of facing, the Minotaur is the shadow. It's facing yourself. It's, am I able to really, and not only face it, but conquer this shadow? Although I would say in my work that conquer is sometimes not as helpful as
Yeah.
integrate, which is really what individuation is. But the metaphor, in terms of being willing to do it, to go to the center and to have that shadow chasing you and knowing that it's hunting you, but being willing to face it instead and say, this is what I need to do. And now that I have met it, um, now I'm going to follow this thread that was given to me by someone who cares about me, who has an understanding of how to get out, and following that back out into the light of who I am, having had this transformative experience,
Mm.
is definitely one way to look at that myth. And there was something else you said. I'm trying to remember. That I wanted to bring up too. Oh, that this is, back to kind of Campbellian hero journey, that this looking at our stories and following the labyrinth into the middle and following and finding your shadow and is an opportunity. It's a call to adventure. And so
Hmm.
every time that we have an opportunity to see ourselves more deeply and to understand the dynamic that's happening with someone else, if we're always fighting and in conflict, one thing I have with unstorying is a conflict diagram that starts off with, what is your prior relationship? And then it could be anything. It could be a partner, or it could be, the person at the store, or whatever it is. Like, what were you before this moment happened? And then there's a moment in time when an event happens. And so that event is in and of itself just a moment in time. It's not interpretive, but then we interpret it. And so what does it mean? Why did that happen? Why did that person do what they did? They didn't do what they were supposed to do. I didn't do what I was supposed to do. The storying begins, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah, we're
then
meaning making machines, Dylan.
that's
Yeah.
exactly it. That we are exactly it. And so at that moment is the only time that you actually have any control over that dynamic, that potential conflict at all. Because the moment that you start crafting stories around what that moment in time, um, you're either looking inward at what is happening, or you are projecting outward onto the person in the situation. And so that's when unstorying process comes in.
Mm.
And
In
once
that
you
liminal space.
that liminal space, you unravel the thread of what story is actually happening under the surface. And I use the term I feel stories, not I feel emotion, like an emotion. I feel angry. I feel unheard. I feel unseen. I feel taken advantage of. I feel pushed aside. I feel unworthy, whatever it may be. That we find the crux of what is actually being experienced. And then we come to realize how old that is in our psyche. It's really, really old. It was experienced really, really young and imprinted then. And then there was a protective mechanism that kicked in because that young child can't process that experience, doesn't really understand. And now that whole interpretive model is what happens when something happens that feels just like that. Again, even if the circumstances have changed, we're projecting that old experience onto that new experience. And that's the opportunity. So the opportunity is we're human, and we're going to have that emotion flood our energy, flood our body, and the storying is going to show up. But do we have the ability to stop in that moment and go into the labyrinth and go, I'm going to actually face what is really happening? I'm going to unravel the thread to get at what the core is. That's all that's happening right now, is that the story of I'm feeling unseen is actually coming up right now. That's all that's happening.
Mm.
And once you sit with the emotion that comes from that, you have a choice. You can restory that narrative. I'm not actually being unseen. That person is just doing their own story. They're just in their own story right now. That's actually not even what's happening. Or I'm feeling this way. I'm going to talk with that person about it. Now you're responding to the situation. You're not reacting out of the old stuff. And then you're not in control of what happens once you now move into the next stage, and that may change your relationship. And so that conflict cycle now becomes opportunity everywhere in that space, as opposed to just something that's happening to you that you can't control. If more people could actually do that, we would not be in the state that we are in at the
Yeah,
moment.
yeah. I want to bring Mike in here because this is a slightly different. Let's call it a hero with a different mask on, but the same vocabulary. Um, whether we talk about this as the labyrinth or story, what is trauma other than being, oh, my life has moved beyond the labyrinth, but my psyche or even my body is still back there, right? It's still in those winding turns because, either you've lost the golden thread or otherwise. But yeah, I wanted to bring you in, Mike, and it's just such similar vocabulary.
For sure. Thank you for that segue. I've been waiting for my moment.
Sorry, Mike.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I'm really absorbed in what you're saying, and I'm seeing so many golden threads here connecting what you do to trauma integration is how I like to frame trauma healing. Because really, what it is not about fighting those old parts. It's about learning from them, right?
Right.
And so I have a couple questions that I'd like to pre-frame with some experiences that came up as you were talking about unstory and shadow work. So I see trauma integration as a maturation process, perhaps an individuation process. And so through my process of personal healing, as I learned uh, all the different aspects of, okay, well, you need to find a coherent narrative rather than the fragmented one that tends to happen when we have, our moment of impact that changes our story, right? Where we're not able to make sense of it yet. And Dr. Daniel Siegel talks about how creating a coherent narrative, a story that allows us to understand our history, is a big part of what indicates that healing is going on. So, a specific moment that happened for me that was pretty profound. I went to the Amen clinics. If you're familiar with them, they do brain scans. So with SPECT scans, they measure blood flow in the different areas of the brain. And so, as part of my healing process, I went there to figure out, okay, do I have ADHD? Because that's how I was diagnosed. And let me get specific about what's going on in the brain. Anyway, the long and the short of it is, yes, the symptoms of ADHD and the brain patterns came up. The prefrontal cortex was less functional. As a matter of fact, the harder you try with ADHD, the worse it gets, the less blood flow, which is a shutdown response. Fascinating. So for most people, when you try harder, you get more blood flow into the prefrontal cortex. There's all sorts of details as to why that happens. But there was this really profound detail that showed up for me, as well as for my son and a friend of mine. We all did the same work, and we had some similarities in our personality. And that is, there's this area in the back of the brain called the posterior cingulate gyrus. And the posterior cingulate gyrus is known for a couple of things. One, high IQ. I think that I can rule that one out for me.
High story. That's a story, but okay.
That's
High
some
creativity.
walking to do.
Definitely can see that. The third thing is this ability to have meta awareness. And I had this light bulb moment when I realized, oh my God, of all of the areas of my brain that weren't working properly, that area was lit up like a Christmas tree. And it allowed me to have a meta view of myself. I was able to watch myself and watch the stories that I was playing out in a given moment. And I was able to compare that to other people in my life and how are they playing out their stories. And I had this way of sort of weaving together these different perspectives that I didn't realize I had a gift in until I looked at it that way. And what it led to is this ability to see myself when I was acting from the arrested emotional development that came from early trauma. And instead of controlling the impulse with my prefrontal cortex, I was just able to see it enough times where I was like, oh, it's happening again. Better not do that again because that doesn't work out very well for you in that narrative. So, um, my question for you is that in that space of unstorying and finding your shadows and as a process of maturation or individuation, where do you see that self-awareness as a key piece of shifting from an incoherent narrative to something that's more coherent, as well as finding that space where there is no story, the unstory you're talking about. I'm very curious what your take is on that.
That space of self-awareness is everything. It's literally everything as far as unstoring is concerned. The ability to step back, whether it's a function of the brain or a function of awareness, that detachment that we hear about often in many belief systems and practices, that is what the aim is. Because if once you're understanding what is operating under the surfaces and you can see that you are not that, you are what is watching that. You have the ability to be aware of that. But most people are so wrapped up in their stories and their reactivity, the emotion, the energy that starts, rolling around the body and informing you that things are not okay. And therefore, now I'm feeling just this overwhelming anger, or I'm feeling fear, I'm feeling rejection, I'm feeling desperate, whatever it might happen to be. And that welling up of the energy that just has a particular flavor in the body starts sending us into new stories when we try and make sense of it. And that's kind of how the mind and the story making ability and the energy within the body and the emotions kind of all play a part, and they activate each other. And so
Mm.
the ability to stop and step back and see the process that's happening, you're able to stop it in its tracks. Now, it doesn't mean, we are human, and so it doesn't mean that, okay, well, you start doing this work and practice it, every single day, and you will never have that experience of reactivity again. I can't say that because that's not the way it works. But the moment from having the reactive experience where you go into story to the moment where you step back and you go, oh, all that's happening right now is it's my old story of I feel no one likes me. I feel whatever it is. That's actually all that's happening right now because you're retracting the projections from the people involved.
Mhm.
And that is similar to what you're talking about. You're stepping back from the story and you're seeing the story for what it is. And then there's a further separation of, yes, but I'm still feeling this energy in my system. I'm still feeling really angry. I'm still feeling really afraid. And so, what do you do with that? So, you still keep the story just for the moment aside, the people that are involved, the context, just for a moment aside. They're not going anywhere. Now let's be in the emotion of it. And people have a lot of trouble with that. It's why our response is the fight, flight, hide, and numb. It's where addiction comes in because no one wants to feel that emotion again in their system. And because they feel justified to doing something about it because the story is so prevalent along with the feeling in their body, they need to do something about it. And they usually choose one of those things. And so because they don't want to feel it. So if they in that moment instead sit in the energy without the story, I'm just going to feel the energy. It's just energy. It can't do anything to me. It's just rolling around the body, whether it's breathing exercises, whether it's visualization exercises, whether it's going for a walk, not, I'm going to exercise this out of me and everything, because then now you're numbing through exercise, but things like I'm going to stand in the shower and let the water just roll over me. I'm going to, there's things you can do that are designed to be with the energy until it diffuses. And then you can clearly see the stories that you were carrying. Okay, now I'm carrying the story about it. That's actually all that was happening what's going to happen now? So if you're carrying old trauma stories, things that happened to you, those things happened to you. That event occurred. And so often when I work with people who are dealing with trauma, and I have one practitioner who just went through my program who is a trauma specialist. She does work with people, domestic violence survivors, refugee survivors, migrant survivor populations. So one of the things that I've talked about with her is that sometimes in that active moment when you are in trauma response, that's not the moment to stop and go into unstorying. You have to tell your story. You have to be in the story, step into the story and say, this is my story, this is what I'm experiencing. There's something about owning your story. It's just that that's not the end space.
Mm.
And that at
Mm.
some point when there's ground under your feet and you feel heard in what it is that you experienced, then there is the ability to go in and say, how going forward, this is now a story that I carry. How am I going to not project this onto everything I'm experiencing? I as an aside, so I teach college courses as well, and I teach mythology often. And I can't teach mythology without teaching personal mythology and asking people to, read the story. How do you relate to these characters in the story? And I had someone once who was a domestic violence survivor, and she was still in some ways still interacting with um, the perpetrator because they had children, and it was, a whole thing. And you know, we talked a lot about honoring the space that they're in, right? And so she did some project on Medusa, seeing herself as Medusa,
Mm.
because Medusa was an assault victim, basically, if you look at the stories, and then was punished for that by Athena to make matters worse, and then killed and her head lopped off. And but
And then
Medusa,
worn on the breastplate of
yeah, I mean,
Athena for all of time. Yeah.
there are so many ways to interpret that story, really, some of which Athena felt bad for, although I don't know if I would give Athena that credit necessarily. But there was definitely this sense of when I look in the mirror, what do I see? I see, Medusa was basically a living corpse with snakes for hair and all of this sort of thing. So that's her image of herself. And then when others would gaze on her, they would turn to stone, which is a metaphor for they didn't want to have anything to do with. They were, couldn't be with her, couldn't offer her love, couldn't, a variety of things. And so this student, we were talking about that, and that's what she sees. And I said, well, going forward, knowing that this is part of the tapestry. I talk about tapestry of who we are because there's so many different parts that make up the wholeness of who we are, including the shadow, that if that is all you see when you are not only looking in a mirror yourself, but looking in the mirror of other potential relationships going forward, if you're in protective mode, because everyone you see is going to potentially be another perpetrator in your life, you're still living in the trauma story. And there needs to be a way at some point to be able to see that story and how it's informing your interaction in the world. So there's definitely a lot that kind of goes into that connection for sure.
Thank you.
I
I'm what you're saying
Go ahead,
about.
Mike.
Sorry about that. I'm hearing a lot of what you're saying about unstorying as connected to, what you're when you said set the story aside and feel the feelings. That's a big part of what somatic work is.
Mm.
And it sounds very similar in terms of allowing the feelings to process rather than trying to do something with them. Just be in that space and allow them to run their course. Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor has a wonderful book, if you're familiar with it, called My Stroke of Insight. She had a stroke in the left hemisphere of her brain, a brain scientist, and she lost her function for about 7 years. And as she came back, she chose to uh, basically restart certain aspects of her left hemisphere function, and certain aspects she decided not to because she didn't like them very much. In the process, she felt as a firsthand experience, consciously being aware that emotions only took about 90 seconds to take their course, unless she would pick them back up again, which is what we do unconsciously. And so why do we feel anything for longer than 90 seconds? Because we keep running that story.
That's
And
exactly it.
yeah. And so ultimately what I'm hearing there is that unstorying is uh, a process of allowing the somatic and emotional aspects perhaps to process by not resisting them, which often happens automatically in a narrative in the cognitive part of our brains.
That's right. It's integration is about embracing. It's not the misunderstanding a lot of people have is it's not a condoning. Like there may be things that you've done in your past based on stories that you're carrying or things like that. It's not saying like, well, it's okay. It's okay that I treated that person terribly. It's okay that that's a judgment story in and of itself. So, I'm not here to say right or wrong or good or bad, but that's not the point, really. The point
Hmm.
really is that that makes up the experience of who you are. And if you can really get at the core of where that impulse came from, that belief that created that experience came from, then you can see how it informs your worldview, how it informs how you walk in the world. And if the way we walk in the world is always about pointing fingers outward at the other being the problem and never looking at the things within us that are, our expectations are not being met, or we feel like our story is I feel like I lack the things I need to survive. So you're going to see people all over the place who are supposedly standing in the way of you getting what it is that you need to survive. The key stories that we all carry, it goes down to needing to survive and thrive. And if we perceive that anything stands in our way, we'll create a story about that person, and then we'll decide, do we have to fight them? Do we have to flee from them? Do we have to, what do we have to do? And that happens societally. It happens, and we see it play out all the time. And so when you ask someone that comes and vents about something that's going on. I'm not saying that someone who suffered, physical attack or some sort of, trauma in that sense, but on the general scale of the things that kind of trigger us and get us, crazy, if you ask them, what is the problem? Why is that a problem? Often you can unravel that going back to Labyrinth and Thread, see? But you can go back and back and back and keep asking, well, why is that a problem? Well, why is that a problem? Well, then no one will love me. Why is that a problem? Well, then I'll be all alone. Why is that a problem? I'm not invalidating that they feel that that is a problem, but just asking them to really articulate it. Why is that a problem? Well, then I'll end up all alone in a car somewhere, and I won't be able to support myself. Why is that a problem? Well, I'll probably die. That's the end of every thread. I will
Hmm.
die. I'll die alone. I'll die, whatever it is that, because at our core, that is our biggest fear. Even those of us who say, I know, I have no fear of death or anything like that. We all carry that because it's unknown. And that's a story. And so we've created tons of stories throughout mythology and belief systems to explain what might be next. But the truth of the matter is, we don't really know until we know. And so if that is the core of everything, that this person is keeping me from surviving or thriving, there's immediately a conflict. And often it's ourselves that are the ones keeping us from surviving or thriving because we have a story about ourselves. I'm not good enough. I'm not, capable. I'm not, whatever it might happen to be. And all of that resides in the shadow. Figuring it out resides in the shadow to unravel the stories.
There's a lot
I've
in the shadow. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've always found it fascinating when music or a character in a novel or a mythological character is somebody that you can look at it and go, you can feel so heard or contextual, like everything can fit when you find that character that just, oh man, I felt like I'm understood. And I feel like a lot of what integration is really about, is that contextualizing of our own story within the, does this fit within the human experience, I guess. So we have our personal mythology, the stories we have to tell ourselves, that then if we find the right mythology that exists out in the world, whether in story or somebody else's story or their song, then it kind of overlays and we go, oh, I am a part of this. And it's not like I'm alone in the car by myself going to die. Even if I am, there's a story about that, and it's going to be okay.
Well, and I'll tell you, you just touched on something really important too, which is the story of needing to belong. And so what
Mm,
happens is often with which at its core has the story of the fear of death, being all alone and dying. Because if you don't belong and you're not supported, then are you going to thrive, right? And potentially survive. And so it's how movements start. A lot of people out in the world who are carrying a story of um, you know, uh, I feel unseen, right? And unheard, then
A
their reaction.
Cassandra, you
Well,
know.
yeah, I just did a thing on Cassandra, you know that, right? But it's true. It's like they're feeling that, and so then they'll find someone else who shares the story, who goes, yeah, you're right. I've been feeling unheard and unseen too, and it's their fault.
mm,
So now you've got not only someone who shares your story, who resonates your story with you, but they're willing to find that common denominator for you both to
mm,
focus on. So it works both ways. It can either be the resonant person who helps you to look within, who goes, I can relate to what they're experiencing. I have felt that too. And this is why I feel this, and this is, and kind of continue to do the work. Or you can see it as a partnership that allows you to navigate the world and feed the shadow as opposed to gaining greater self-awareness. And so then movements start from that. We are the group that feels unseen and unheard, and we're going to do something
mhm,
about it. Well, then they do something about it, and the other group that was feeling kind of fine because nothing was triggering their underlying stories, now they're feeling unseen and disrespected and whatever it is. So now they look for the people who are all feeling that same way, keep validating each other's, story, and then they react. And now you have a
mhm,
conflict because and all that it boils down to is the story of feeling like they're not going to be able to survive or thrive if this other group now has their way, and all that other group is trying to do is to survive and thrive. It To me, it's the biggest unfortunate paradox of human nature, and really what needs to be seen right now, right away.
Yeah,
um,
Yeah.
I just did a post today on the Golden Threads Facebook page on a couples or partners labyrinth, and this is one of the things that we're wanting to get into, is when there's those communities kind of at odds with each other because the stories have built up so much. Can we use the labyrinth, which this one has two entrances and a common exit, as a means of facilitating changing community, or at least processing non-verbally that we know that part of this is story, and before we go to arms, we need to recognize that.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's it. If two people enter or two groups enter the labyrinth and they're both going and they find the goal is not to fight each other, but to fight the shadow. But if the shadow is anything outside of themselves, then they're perpetuating a story. Now they're perpetuating a story of other. But if they
Mm,
can see it as the great shadow are the stories we tell ourselves that keep us separate from each other. Because the truth of the matter is, in that space between the stories, beneath the stories, what you come to find is that we're not separate from each other. That
mm,
self-awareness, that awareness that is conscious of the world and of who we are, that is only one thing. And then our experience, our embodied experiences in the world are opportunities to see that for what it is, unless we get bogged down by the story of it all. And so, it's an opportunity again.
Yeah, I wanted to. I've been trying at Mike's suggestion. Sometimes when two PhDs of mythology talk, we make references and don't explain them. So I did want to quickly, just because it's a wonderful story, the Cassandra story. Briefly, she's a princess of Troy during the Trojan War. She is, for mythological reasons, she's cursed to forever see accurate visions of the future and be screaming, about warning people all around her, and no one, they literally can't hear her. Like, it's such a cool description. Like, is she literally silent, or our minds, the people around her, they just warp what she says so that they don't even give her credit after the fact for having predicted it. So it can become a complex, like so many other things. But one thing that really, Nicole, you're really painting in a different light, which I just love. In my dissertation, and oftentimes in talking about soul searching and mythology, I read this quote from James Hillman that is taking on a slightly different um, flavor right now. So I just wanted to read this. This is from James Hillman, and he says, "The soul is ceaselessly talking about itself in ever recurring motifs, in ever new variations, like music, that this soul is immeasurably deep and can only be illuminated by insights, flashes in a vast cavern of incomprehension, and that in the realm of the soul, the ego is a paltry thing." So I love that. And usually I only bring it up in a purely positive way about soul and myth, right? Because we think that the soul doesn't speak, but it does. But what it says there is that it is ceaselessly talking about itself in ever recurring motifs, and that can become problematic, right? So that's what I love about your work, the idea that sometimes a myth, it's our fault for not listening to it the first time. It's the reason we get the same nightmare over and over again, is because we can't seem to pay attention to it. Like Cassandra, we don't listen. But that is, you almost get more of a vibe of like an annoying younger sibling here. Sometimes soul is just because of trauma, because it is repeating ad nauseum the same myth in little micro forms in all of your daily life, which, just to bring it back once more, what I love about the idea of unstoring and connecting that with the labyrinth would be that, of course, as you've said, you're not saying there's anything problematic or even less than beautiful about story, but the idea of saying, oh, if you've got this labyrinth near you, you can go and play out that myth whenever you want to there. Give it its time, give it its story time, and then be able to go to work and have relationships where this isn't cropping up in every sentence, as the same victim story, or as the same survival story, or whatever else other complexes we're dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, and remember that, soul is actually psyche, being psychology, being the study of the soul, until Freud came in and a bunch of others and said, that sounds very religious. We can't call it that, it has to be the mind, it has to be something different. But it is actually the study of that essence, of us, and what creates meaning, what creates our reality, and it's not the same reality that we're all walking in. And I think that that's really, really important that people understand, is that we always assume that our parameters of what is right and wrong and makes sense and how things are interpreted is the way things are, but everyone is coming from their own perspective, which is why, you brought up Cassandra. I recently, did a podcast on Narcissus and Cassandra, and how the ways in which, we can only see what we can see. It's going to Plato's allegory of the cave. I don't know if you're familiar with that story. Men were chained in a cave, and, couldn't see what humans look like or see themselves, and all they could see was the reflection of the shadows on the cave wall, and that's what they thought it was from the fire in the opening. And one man's chains, drop, and he goes outside and he goes, okay,
Whoa.
there's a lot more to who we are and what's
Stone
going
him.
on. And yeah, and people couldn't handle it, and how we respond to having our awareness uh, cracked open or expanded tells us also something about what's in our shadow.
Yeah.
Are we curious and say, I'm not going to agree or disagree, but I'm going to investigate myself? Do we immediately shut down? Do we get angry about it and threatened by it? And we're doing that, as humans too. The other thing I wanted to talk about was something you just mentioned, which is that it shows up in our dreams, right? So the thing about lucid dreaming, which I find really interesting. So one of the things I offer in Unstorying is this construct of a guided visualization, a place that I construct that people go to, and there's rooms and things and activities that they do in it that are access points for their own inner wisdom, that then the assignment afterwards is go visit it again, and it's now always available to you to access these different things. Well, one thing that starts to happen is that then when you're lucid dreaming, when you're dreaming, that even if you can't affect change in the first time that you dream it, if you wake up, if there's this intention, I'm going to go back in and I'm going to ask that aspect of the dream what it needs. Because that's a big thing of shadow work. I have people go in to these guided visualizations, face an aspect of the shadow, however it may appear to them, and say, what is it that you need to come to the conscious, to come to
Hmm.
light, to be part of me? What do you need? Not, and also, who are you? What do you represent? And then what is it you need? And sometimes it's just a reminder that you're loved. It's like a simple thing that sounds very kind of like, frivolous in that sense, but at our core, we often forget that very simple thing. We feel we're not loved because this person said this to us and this thing happened, and then we're not good enough, and those are all old messages that we've gotten along the way. They don't mean anything. They are
Yeah,
just, yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, one of the things that I find is an easy way to introduce the power of the labyrinth is to talk about how the cognitive dissonance that exists in just the simple uh, estimation of how long will this walk take versus how long does it actually take. Our experience will invariably show us, whoa, I was way off there, because it's always longer than we imagine. And this is something that Dylan has often brought up. For me, that little bit of I can doubt myself then allows me to doubt the other things I'm supposed to doubt, as opposed to just assuming that the rest of my brain is just running perfectly like a computer and it's going to go to the right program next and it's going to run that file, as opposed to the other one that it shouldn't be running.
It's having grace for yourself, that it's
Yes.
not always going to be getting it. You're not always going to be right. You're fallible, and that's okay. It's taking that as an opportunity. I use the opportunity a lot, but
Yeah.
if we see it as an opportunity to then see ourselves more clearly, as opposed to berate ourselves or push ourselves aside once again, which is what all we've been doing.
Yeah.
Um,
Because positive
yeah.
self-doubt is the only way to get something better in ourselves. Like, we have to doubt ourselves in order to change. Otherwise, we will run with the status quo. It will
I don't know if
always remain.
I wouldn't use doubt, but I understand what you're saying
Sure.
with it. I
Yeah.
I think I would use curiosity or self uh questioning
Or just the sense of multifacetedness, right? That we're
right,
not one thing.
right, and that's okay, and let's explore that,
Yeah.
kind of thing. So but I understand what you're saying with self-doubt. Yeah, this sense of, not necessarily trusting whatever the story is that's kind of,
Yeah. I
arising.
don't mean it in a tear ourselves down way. I just mean it that there are definitely uses in doubt that we often shy away from because there's a stigma around doubting ourselves We want the self-confidence. We want to always
Right.
come across as sure of ourselves. And
Yes.
I don't know if I've ever fully felt that way. So why should I expect that of myself?
That's a
So I find that positive self-doubt as like, it doesn't mean I'm degrading myself. It means that there are going to be times where I need to recognize my shortcomings or else I can't get better.
yes, yes, the willingness to have self-clarity for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And no one, and that is kind of the basis of imposter syndrome because everyone is walking around
Mhm.
thinking that everybody else has got it. They all understand, they're all very capable, they're all very confident, and nobody is. Nobody, if they are, they're a fool because no
Yeah.
way. There's no way that we know everything,
Yeah,
or
I wish I could agree that no one thinks that they know what they're doing. There are some people that have
oh,
a have a different side of that complex.
they
You gotta
they
love
do.
Plato's apology for that whole story of going to find the wisest person on earth so he can disprove that he was the wisest.
I mean, that is the other side of that story, but it doesn't make it any more true. So
Yeah.
when we put ourselves down because we're not sure that we're fully capable or the best at something, we're only carrying a story about it. And someone who is like, I never make a mistake, that's narcissism. That's hedging into another whole world there for that, for sure, for
The
sure. But
antithesis of Cassandra.
that's right. And I wanted to add one thing about the labyrinth, and Ariadne. And what's very interesting about Theseus is that yes, he succeeds in leaving the labyrinth and continuing on his quest and the promise he made to Ariadne that he would take her off the island and he would marry her and all of this sort of thing. And what happens?
He abandons her right away.
So his experience of going within and facing that monster within and everything was not the end of the process for him. It is an experience of facing the shadow, and yet there's more. His wanting to please his father and impress his father that he is a great warrior and worthy of eventually being king and all of this sort of thing had him wrapped up in that story that he lost care and compassion for someone who assisted him and who had fallen in love with him. And so, just because we do the process once of doing this does not mean that there is not more in there to
Yeah,
face.
and for me, that's an instance of when he abandons her, that is whether from a religious context or a mythological context, that's the ego falsely taking credit for the transformation it was able to achieve, for getting over, for integrating with the shadow, as if that was Theseus with his sword going in. Like literally in the story, you couldn't have done that without the golden thread of Ariadne. And what you see is his life takes a nosedive immediately after that. He abandons Ariadne and forgets to take his sails down, thereby causing the death of his father, the almost Freudian, irony in there. And then he becomes the tyrant very quickly. I don't mean to say that there's nothing good left in his myth, but for me, it is the moment of what makes him different from a Hercules hero is his ability to ask for help from Ariadne. And then he abandons that, and you could say, like you said, the Minotaur is the shadow. That is, Theseus grows up idolizing Heracles, idolizing his father, and believing that to be the only form of hero, right? Is the brute strength hero when he's going to be something very different. So when he goes into the labyrinth, what does he face? The Minotaur, which is a perfect image of his specific shadow, that brute force, heroic masculine binary sort of model, you could say. I mean, I think that this is bringing us full circle in some really nice ways. I did want, well, even if this is shoehorning it in, I wanted to get your take, Nicole, on the connection to the archetypal feminine. I know that's a grossly general term, but in folklore, in fairy tale, in story, in myth, there are so many connections between the weaving process, the golden thread of narrative, and the feminine. I wanted to hear what sort of jumps to mind for you with why those connections are so deeply rooted.
I think what would resonate for me is that one of the aspects of the divine feminine is creator, right? The creation, the place where things can be nurtured and developed, and, as in a womb, sort of analogy. And so when you have the divine feminine enter into a myth, it will often be, but then again, remember that there's two sides of the divine feminine. There's the nurturing and the devouring, right? So the
Mm-hmm.
mother, especially that archetype. And so there's this need to create things, to give a space for things to develop, whereas they're not often the more of the force involved, which is often considered part of the divine masculine. In order the action that's taken, they create the space for the action to happen. And so I think that from an archetypal standpoint, specifically, is why you'll often see, even Athena was a weaver. I
Mhm.
mean, you have the story of her and Arachne, having the weaving contest, and this idea that this goddess, who is the goddess of strategy
In
and
war, yeah.
war and all of this sort of thing, she's also, I'm going to sit here at this loom and I'm going to, create some art. That there is something to be said for the feminine in strategy and battle. What is being crafted? What is being created? I think that, when you look at the two archetypes of the divine feminine and the divine masculine, and often the divine feminine, it's about carefully crafting and creating the space for whatever it is that is needing to happen. So whether it's war, so that's why she's strategy as opposed to Aries, who is just, let's just fight.
Yeah, from above,
Um,
right.
so it's a different way in, for that space, different aspect.
Yeah, you could also add in um, the umbilical cord as the golden thread, as the epitome of everything that a former older generation needs to pass on to the next generation. We send through story and myth, and culture. So, like you said, the womb of the tomb and the tomb of the womb, passing. That's brings an image to my mind.
Mhm.
I know I'm Labyrinth obsessed, but thinking of Ariadne as the mother of Theseus, I know that's not narratively true, but the idea of passing that golden thread, heading into the labyrinth, and weaving, and coming, winding back out, and that being the full life cycle, of you
I,
know, yeah.
I think what's interesting with the umbilical as a symbol, that there's the nurturing fluids, that pass through that to the receiver, the baby, or whoever it may happen to be. There's something to that. But I think that also when you think about it, that it's not always the mother. I mean, it is in the biological, physiological sense
Mhm.
of birth, but it's not always the mother that is offering that the life force and the nurturing in order to support the divine masculine. or whoever else is on the other end of that thread. So, whether it's a partner, whether it's someone else in your life who carries that divine feminine, and they are offering this life force to you to be able to do what it is that you do. There's a metaphor for that as well, no matter how that shows up in your world, whether it's emotional support, whether it's, um, you know, creating the space for you to do what you need to do. And this transcends man and woman, of course. We need that to be said, that this is just, if you're carrying the divine feminine energy in a situation and you are offering that life force, that nurturing to someone else in order for them to do what it is for their quest, for them to complete their quest, that's a space that you can be in. And if you are on the receiving end, in that dynamic, you're carrying the divine masculine energy of that balance in that moment. Again, whether man or woman, just this sense of I'm receiving and I'm going to do something with that. I'm going to find my way out. I'm going to, and also when you think about it, if the thread is indeed an umbilical cord, then he's following it back to its source in order for him to get out of the labyrinth. So there's something to be said for finding that divine feminine source again in order to really exit the labyrinth.
Right. I like that you said again. Yeah. The returning to the source, because you have to individuate first. I don't want to go too deep into that, but you have to get that illusion, even if it's an illusion of separation, but then you need to, refind it.
And to tie that one more time into unstorying, just because I can in this moment, is that when you are finding you're going back to source, that really is that essence of that space that I was talking about between and beneath your stories. So there's what is the source that created the experience of the world for you, going in, facing the shadow, facing the monsters within, facing the things that you don't want to look at for whatever the reason is. And that could be golden shadow too, according to Jung, which are actually the positive traits and characteristics that you carry that you've been told are not okay for whatever reason. Anything that's in there that you've shoved away into that closet of the shadow psyche, that you are able to be with it, to face it, to understand its relevance in you, and then that is able to pull you out of the labyrinth and back to the source again. So it's not like you're somewhere else. The whole experience of it is to have more clarity of who you really are. And that is the individuation process, to really see all of you, and embrace all of you, to be whole. That's the point of individuation, not to heal something and push it away, to be it, to be all of it. So that also ties in with that.
I was happy to hear that term, the golden shadow. I was watching some of the videos that you had on your website and really enjoyed them, by the way. And this whole part of my life has kind of been a rediscovery of some of those things. And I wasn't expecting that so much, stepping out of active pastoral work for a while to get my head on straight. And some of the things that came back out was the art side of things. Visual arts was not something that I even imagined being so big a part of my life right now. And yet that's most of what I'm doing. It's weird. I still haven't figured out why that disappeared, but it's fun to go, oh, it's been there for a very long time. But anyways, I had never heard that term, and it seems to make a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, because so many people associate shadow with trauma and pain. And I must have had some sort of painful experience when I was young, and that is true. That does form part of your shadow, but it also could be something where, you were drawing all sorts of pictures, or you were drawing on the walls and you were enjoying it because it was just the expressiveness of art, and someone came to you and went, "Don't do that. What's wrong with, go do your homework," I mean, and and shadow doesn't always get created because someone has done something wrong to you. Like it's sometimes
Mm,
it's just the story then that gets crafted by that moment of I'm just expressing myself and myself, and you're telling me that that's not okay, and now you have the message of it's not okay, and so you shrink yourself to be what it is that the belief stories are now telling you you should be. And that's why the golden shadow, elements get lodged in there too. And so when you go in to face your shadow, you'll see a multitude of things in there because we are a multitude of stories. We're a multitude of experiences. The things we judge as good and bad, it's irrelevant. It's what are we pushing away that are actually
mm,
part of us.
Yeah, and
Um,
they're and not always pushed away. So, as you said, not necessarily even aggressively. When we are born into this physical vessel, we are usually born as a male or a female. That creates shadow, right? You choose a profession because you can't be all. That creates shadow, and you forge relationships with some people, and you can't have hundreds of thousands of friends or acquaintances, and that creates shadows, the shadows of what might have been. Um,
yeah.
and not all of those, not only are they not negative, that's my whole dissertation was the opposite side of that shadow spectrum, what I called the foreshadow, what you're more or less calling the golden shadow. But yeah, that's what you're facing with the golden thread there, with the labyrinth. That's one thing that Jung said at one point was he said, all these talks of is this the shadow? Is this the shadow? The whole of the unconscious is the shadow. So everything that isn't ego, the ego is the odd man out, odd person out. Uh, and by having that ego perspective, which we need, the rest of it that could have been becomes shadow, and it's the source as well. So,
It's everything that's not in our consciousness,
right.
that we're not conscious of, and so and that's how our persona gets created. Our the personality, how we react to things, why we react to things, how we, carry ourselves in the world. A lot of it is based on the things we're aware of about ourselves and the things that we're not aware of about ourselves, but that don't go away. They say that, what is it, energy or matter, I think, can't,
neither created nor destroyed,
that's right.
or something like that.
And that's the same of our experiences, and that the energy that is caused by those, they get lodged in there. They don't go anywhere. And even if we don't think about them, I don't want to think about them. That was years ago. I've moved on from there. It's always going to be part of the experience. And it's this, as you were talking about too, when you come into this incarnation and you're born, there's a narrative thread that begins that threads through your entire life. And some of it comes from choices. There'll be people who will tell you that we don't make choices, that things, unfold as they do. I'm one of those people, but I do get the whole idea of the experience of making choices, right? And so as things unfold, you look back and you see that your life could not have really been that much different. All the choices that we think we could have made, the ones that we ended up making, led us into an opportunity for greater awareness about who we are, and an experience that led to the next experience that wouldn't have happened any way otherwise. But there's always the stories that are left behind. What if this time around I was something different? What if I experienced something different? And then that feeling of lack that you're not experiencing that aspect of us. The, you know, when you go to some Eastern philosophies, this idea of that all we are is this consciousness, whether it's God, whether it's consciousness, whether it's awareness, that it's having its own experiences by us being embodied and having these experiences in the world. We're interacting with each other to give the consciousness an ability to experience itself. Otherwise it can't, because it's just awareness, right? And so if you go based on that premise, then it all kind of makes sense, in that where it's just always looking for wholeness. It's always looking for the piece that it doesn't have, because it needs to, it has this instinct to become whole. And so
Yeah,
we see
to
that in our
regain
own,
that totality.
yeah, we see that in our own lives just as people that we're trying to, find our partner. We're trying to find the career that gives us fulfillment. We're going to find the perfect house. We're going to find whatever it is so that we can be whole. And then we somehow never become whole because we're missing the point,
Mhm.
right? Because it's not about those things. It's about all of us. We are already whole, thinking that we are not.
Mm.
Yeah, well, even a podcast will
Yeah.
have shadows of what might have been, the stories that weren't able to be told. I do think we should start winding our ball back up. Um, so I don't have a sort of formal closing, but I wanted to sort of pass it around to each person, get a sense of um, something in the golden thread of this conversation that spoke to you specifically. So I'll start for myself that seeing the, let's call it the um, seeing the shadow, the negative aspects of the Minotaur in the Labyrinth was something that I was kind of trying to push away for a while, because in the modern Labyrinth movement, we're always trying to say, no, this is not some frightening underworld journey, etc. But it can and needs to be. There's a reason that myth starts there. So that's going to leave me following some interesting lines myself. Um, yeah, I'll pass it off to Mike. Did you have any sort of final thoughts or final threads to pull?
Yeah. So fascinated with the unstorying concept as it relates to somatic work. And the way that you framed it helped me to see it in a different light. That is, I always took the story, the narrative, as a verbal experience, a more conscious experience, whereas the somatic and even the emotional realms are nonverbal and so therefore don't really have a narrative. But in a sense, it's just a different way of experiencing it because it's just the embodied experience of it, right? So taking that frame, that point of view, even paradigm, even shifting perspective to the embodied experience, which, by the way, earlier on when I was talking, making the joke about, I couldn't be high IQ, that was indicating, what was going on. That in its totality, if you take the full perspective of where I'm coming from on that, it was actually um, that I see that intellectually that there have been challenges, but it allowed recognizing that, owning that, and golden shadow, if I'm using this correctly, is recognizing that my gift of being able to be in an embodied space gave me a different type of
Mhm.
gift, a different type of capacity to read myself and become aware of where I sit and where everyone else sits from a feelings perspective rather than from an intellectual perspective. And that has its value um, in contrast to what our society typically values, which is typically pretty intellectual and conscious. Um, so thank you for shedding some light on that. That's helping me to see somatic healing and sort of the unstorying, which in a sense is its own story, a little differently. So thank you for that.
Mm. All right, I guess I'll jump in here and then we'll give you the last word as we go. One of the things that I'm most excited about kind of moving forward is thinking more about the use of shadow work with communities. And the line that I wrote down, I had to quote it because it was just really good thinking about it within the context of community, is that if the story is outside of self, it just adds to the shadows, is something that you said, Nicole. And it doesn't mean that those aren't going to happen because we have to tell those stories. But as soon as we start building action around stories that we can't confirm because it's not something within ourselves, we have to be very careful. And so, anyways, I'm just thinking a lot about how the use of shadow work and the stories we tell ourselves can be a part of our healing as well, and using the labyrinth to bring that about. So just really appreciate having you here, and you said so many cool things. Just a great conversation.
Well, thank you. I mean, I really enjoyed talking with all of you as well about these topics. You can tell how near and dear to my heart they are, and how I really just want to get this message out of people
Mm-hmm.
having greater awareness about who they are and that they are far bigger and far more amazing than they really understand themselves to be. And I don't mean that in an ego sense, in a narcissistic sense. I mean that in an actual, genuine sense of self.
Mm-hmm.
Self with the big S. This who are we, and are we following our stories only? And I love the image of the labyrinth that you all bring to this, and the potentness of that image and the symbol and the archetype of in so many different ways. It's a maze, but it's not a maze. It's a way in, it's a way out. Can you come out exactly the same way that you went in? Or do you go out a different route because you're now transformed and you're now changed in some
Mm-hmm.
way? The role of the thread, and the role of, what if you went in without a thread? Would you still find your way out? And what is the thread? Is the thread processes that we all learn and are trained in and can offer people of that they can take with them in order to do the work? Can they do it without the things that we offer? Yes, and there's so many things about that mythic kind of image of the labyrinth itself, and then bringing Ariadne's story into it, and how she and Theseus kind of work with each other on it. What is Ariadne getting out of the situation of helping him face his own monster? This is her brother, her half brother, the Minotaur. So, but why does she want to escape the island? What is it that she's running from? And I think it's important to not forget that piece of the story as well too. Often it's the people who are struggling themselves, or um, are dealing with their own shadow, who are still offering us a lifeline for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to be aware of that. And it's his lack of awareness of her needs, her true needs, that stunted his continual growth.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Nicole Miller. I'm Dr. Dylan Odner. We've got Alan Cowley, Mike Thomas, and so from the Golden Thread podcast, we hope you've enjoyed the discussion today, and I hope you'll tune back in for the next one, whenever that may be. Follow that golden thread with us. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks a lot.